My school is forcing us to learn a language that doesn't exist. Monday morning, the principal announced that we had a new mandatory elective called Chapelish Studies, and everyone needed to report there instead of second period. What the hell is Chapelish? I asked my friend Alex. He had no idea. No one did. We filed into our assigned rooms where a teacher I'd never seen before was writing strange symbols on the board. "I'll be teaching you the most important language you'll ever learn," she said. "This is the Chapelish alphabet. You'll need to memorize these by tomorrow." "What country speaks this?" I raised my hand. "That's not important right now," she said. "What matters is that you learn it." That night, I Googled Chapelish and got 0 results. Nothing. Not even a Wikipedia stub. I tried every spelling variation, checked language databases, emailed linguistics professors. The language didn't exist anywhere except our school. Within a week, kids were already stringing together basic sentences in Chapelish, which shouldn't have been possible so fast, but the grammar was weirdly intuitive, and everyone was picking it up faster than any language should be learned. "Doesn't this freak you out?" I asked Alex. "Why?" he said. "It's easy, and I'm getting an A." Within a month, Chapelish was spreading through school like a virus with signs in hallways and teachers using phrases in other classes and kids speaking it between periods because they actually wanted to practice it. I kept asking where this language came from, but the teacher just smiled and said to focus on fluency, while the principal called it an innovative pilot program, even though the school board had no record of approving it, and the Department of Education had never heard of it. I started recording the lessons and studying the structure, finding 37 characters in an alphabet that didn't match any known language family, no Latin roots or Germanic structure or Asian tonal patterns, just something completely unique that had appeared from nowhere. Then I discovered we weren't alone, because 17 other schools had started teaching Chapelish the same Monday we did, scattered across different states with nothing connecting them, except this made-up language. I found a Reddit thread before it got deleted, where kids from these schools were comparing notes, and everything matched perfectly from the alphabet to the grammar to the way teachers refused to explain its origin. I stayed after class and told the teacher I knew about the other schools. "Why these specific schools?" I asked. "You were selected," she said. "By who?" I asked. "That's not important right now," she said. "You're teaching us a made-up language and won't say why," I said. "All languages are made up," she said, "but they have origins and history, and this just appeared one Monday morning," I said. She started erasing the board and said, "Some things are meant to be learned, not understood." By month 2, everyone was obsessed with Chapelish and saying that thinking in it was clearer than English, that ideas formed better in their heads when they used Chapelish grammar structures. Alex stopped responding to texts unless I wrote in Chapelish, and study groups were conducted half in English and half in Chapelish with kids switching between them without noticing. I was the only one still questioning why we were being taught a language that existed nowhere but in our schools, and my parents thought I was overreacting while my friends thought I was being difficult for no reason. The school announced that standardized tests would include a Chapelish section and college applications would favor fluency in it, which made kids double down on studying even though nobody could tell them what college would do with a language that didn't exist anywhere else. Month 3, and I watched my friends disappear deeper into this fake language, preferring it to English and thinking in it first, before translating back when they had to speak to teachers who didn't know it. The worst part was that I was getting fluent too, despite my resistance, because the language worked its way into your brain, whether you wanted it or not, and sometimes I caught myself thinking in Chapelish and had to force myself back to English like pushing through fog. Then the teacher brought in a new textbook with symbols I'd never seen before, ancient-looking things that hurt to stare at too long. "This is advanced Chapelish," she said, "for those ready to progress." "Progress to what?" I asked. She looked at me and said, "To understanding why you're really learning this language." "So tell me," I said. "You have to be ready first," she said. "You have to stop resisting." The class continued in advanced Chapelish, and I couldn't understand a single word, even though everyone else was following along perfectly, taking notes in symbols that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. They were leaving me behind, because I kept demanding answers instead of just accepting what was happening. After class, I saw them writing notes in the advanced symbols, having conversations I couldn't follow, and I realized I had 2 choices: keep demanding answers and be left out completely, or give in. I woke up Tuesday morning with my head pounding like someone had been hammering nails into my skull all night. The advanced Chapelish symbols were still burned into my vision when I closed my eyes, those weird shifting shapes that hurt to look at for too long. I sat up in bed and grabbed my notebook from the nightstand, flipping through 5 weeks of documentation I'd been keeping since this whole thing started. Photos of the alphabet, recordings of lessons, notes about the 17 other schools, screenshots of that deleted Reddit thread. I had all this evidence, but nothing that actually proved what was happening or why. My alarm went off and I dragged myself out of bed, knowing I had to make a choice today between giving up and fighting harder, because staying in the middle wasn't working anymore. Mom was making coffee when I came downstairs, and I dropped into a chair at the kitchen table feeling exhausted, even though I'd just woken up. She asked how I was doing, and I told her about yesterday's class, how everyone else was taking notes in advanced chapelish, like it was the easiest thing in the world, while I couldn't understand a single word. The symbols seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them, and everyone was following along perfectly, except me. She sat down across from me and listened without interrupting, which was different from how Dad reacted when I brought this stuff up. When I finished talking, she asked what I wanted to do about it, not in a dismissive way, but like she was actually taking me seriously. I said I didn't know because fighting it was isolating me from everyone, but accepting it felt wrong. She suggested I start by figuring out what rights students actually have when schools change curriculum, whether there are procedures they're supposed to follow for this kind of thing. She said maybe the problem wasn't the language itself, but whether they followed the rules for implementing it. That made sense in a way I hadn't thought about before, focusing on process instead of just complaining about the program. I spent my free period in the library Tuesday afternoon sitting at one of the back computers researching FOIA requests. I'd heard the term before but had no idea how they actually worked or who you were supposed to send them to. The websites I found made it sound complicated and official, with specific language you had to use and proper channels for submitting requests. The Freedom of Information Act apparently let citizens request government records, but schools were tricky because some fell under state laws and others had different rules. I copied down information about how to write a request letter, what kinds of documents I could ask for, and which office handles these things at the district level. It all felt way over my head, like I was trying to navigate some adult system I didn't understand. But Mom was right that I needed to work through proper channels instead of just demanding answers from teachers who wouldn't give them. Lunch was awkward as hell. I grabbed my tray and headed to our usual table where Alex and the group were already sitting. I could hear them talking before I got there, and half the conversation was in Chapalish, words and phrases I recognized from basic lessons, but couldn't follow when they were strung together that fast. They noticed me approaching and switched back to English mid-sentence, but it felt forced, like they were making an effort to accommodate me. I sat down and tried to join the conversation, but kept losing the thread when they'd slip back into Chapelish without thinking. Someone would make a joke, and everyone would laugh except me, because the punchline was in a language I was refusing to learn properly. Alex asked if I wanted to study with them after school, and I said maybe, knowing I wouldn't, because their study sessions were mostly conducted in Chapalish now. The whole lunch period felt like I was making everyone work harder just by being there, like my presence was this annoying reminder that not everyone had bought into the program. That afternoon, I started a symptom journal in a new section of my notebook. I wrote down the date and time, then described the headache I'd had since yesterday, rating it 7 out of 10 for intensity. I documented the mental fog I felt whenever I tried to think in Chapelish, how it was like pushing through something thick and resistant. I wrote about the weird cognitive snap during drills last week, when the grammar suddenly made sense, but in a way that felt wrong, like my brain was rewired without my permission. If something was actually affecting me differently than other students, I wanted a record of when it started and how it was getting worse. I noted that the symptoms began around the time advanced Chapelish was introduced and seemed to get worse after each class. Other kids weren't reporting headaches or fog. They were saying Chapelish made thinking clearer, so either I was having some kind of adverse reaction or I was resisting hard enough that my brain was fighting back. I pulled out my phone and opened my email, composing a message to 3 linguistics professors at nearby universities whose contact information I'd found on department websites. I kept the email professional but detailed, explaining that my school was teaching a language called Chapelish that didn't exist in any database or reference material I could find. I attached photos of the 37-character alphabet and examples of the grammar structure, asking if they recognized any patterns or could identify what language family it might belong to. I mentioned that 17 schools across different states started teaching this simultaneously, all on the same Monday morning, with no explanation of its origins. I said I was trying to understand where this language came from and whether it was normal for schools to teach something with no documented history or academic foundation. I read the email 3 times before sending it, making sure I sounded curious rather than crazy, then hit send to all 3 professors and hoped at least one would respond with something useful. By Thursday morning, I had responses from 2 of the professors sitting in my inbox. The first one was polite, but basically useless, saying he'd never encountered anything like the symbols I'd sent, and suggesting it might be a constructed language created for educational purposes. He mentioned that artificial languages like Esperanto exist for specific reasons, and maybe chapelish was something similar. The second professor's response was longer and more technical, analyzing the grammar patterns I'd described and noting they didn't match any known language family. She said the structure was interesting from a linguistic perspective, but couldn't explain why 17 schools would simultaneously teach something that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. Both professors were professional and tried to be helpful, but neither could answer my actual questions about where this came from or who decided we should learn it. I forwarded both responses to my phone and saved them in a folder with all my other documentation, adding 2 more pieces of evidence that confirmed what I already knew. This language appeared out of nowhere, and nobody outside our schools had any record of it existing. Friday morning, I went to the nurse's office before first period complaining about eye strain and persistent headaches. The nurse was this older woman who'd been at the school forever, and she had me sit on the examination table while she checked my vision with one of those eye chart tests. I told her the headaches started when we began advanced chapelish and got worse after each class, that the symbols hurt to look at for too long. She asked about my screen time and how much sleep I was getting, whether I was drinking enough water and taking breaks from homework. I said yes to all of it, but she didn't seem interested in the connection to chapelish, just kept asking standard questions about dehydration and stress. She gave me a vision test and said my eyes were fine, then told me to drink more water and get 8 hours of sleep, and the headaches would probably go away. I left with a pass back to class, feeling like she'd completely dismissed the one thing I was actually concerned about, treating my symptoms like they had nothing to do with the new class, even though the timing was obvious. Saturday afternoon, I walked through the empty school building with my phone out taking photos. My mom worked in the district office and had gotten me access through the weekend security guard, saying I needed to grab something from my locker. Instead, I went through every hallway photographing the chapelish signage that had appeared over the past month. Vocabulary posters in the main hallway showing common phrases with translations, grammar reminders on bulletin boards near the cafeteria. Even the gym had a poster explaining sports terminology in chapelish, words for basic movements and equipment that had nothing to do with second period language class. What started as one class had spread into every corner of the school, like some kind of infection. I took photos of everything, documenting how this language had invaded spaces that had nothing to do with the actual course. The library had a whole shelf of chapelish materials now, workbooks and readers and reference guides. The student center had conversation tables where kids could practice speaking it during lunch. It wasn't just a class anymore. It was becoming part of the school's entire identity. Monday morning, the principal held a Q&A session in the auditorium about school initiatives and new programs. I showed up early to make sure I got a seat where I could raise my hand, sitting in the middle section with a clear view of the microphone they'd set up for questions. The principal talked for 20 minutes about test scores and college acceptance rates and innovative approaches to education. When he opened the floor for questions, I raised my hand immediately, and he called on me third. I walked to the microphone and asked where chapelish came from, who approved adding it to our curriculum, and why 17 schools across different states all started teaching it on the same day. The auditorium got quiet, and I could feel people staring at me, but I kept my eyes on the principal waiting for an answer. He smiled and launched into scripted talking points about innovative pilot programs and future-ready skills, how chapelish was preparing students for a changing world and giving them advantages in college admissions. He said the program had been carefully designed by education experts and was implemented with full support from the administration. I asked again who specifically approved it and when, but he just repeated the same phrases about pilot programs and innovative approaches, never actually answering where the language came from or who made the decision to teach it. Other students asked questions about sports schedules and parking passes, and the moment passed, leaving me standing at the microphone, knowing I hadn't gotten any real answers at all. That afternoon, I texted Alex asking if we could hang out like we used to, just the two of us without the whole group. He said sure, and we met at the coffee shop near school, where we'd spent hundreds of afternoons over the past 3 years. He showed up 15 minutes late and immediately pulled out his phone, checking messages while I tried to talk about the Q&A session and how the principal dodged every real question. Alex nodded but kept glancing at his screen, and I realized he was in 3 different group chats planning chapelish study sessions for the week. He seemed annoyed when I asked about it, saying I wouldn't understand because I wasn't keeping up with the class material anymore. We sat there for 40 minutes, and he spent at least half that time responding to messages, his attention divided between our conversation and whatever was happening in those study groups. When I brought up my concerns about the program, he sighed and said I was making everything harder by fighting, instead of just learning, and maybe if I put this much energy into actually studying, I'd be fluent by now. We left, without making plans to hang out again. Tuesday evening, my mom dragged me to a PTA meeting where the administration was presenting updates on the school programs. The principal and two teachers stood at the front with a slideshow about Chapelish as a future-proof skill that would give students advantages in college admissions and standardized testing. They talked about how the program was preparing kids for a changing world and how universities were starting to recognize Chapelish proficiency on applications, which made no sense because the language existed nowhere except these 17 schools. Parents asked practical questions about workload and whether the extra studying would affect performance in other classes, and several wanted to know how grades would be calculated and if there were tutoring options available. Nobody challenged the basic premise of teaching a language that had appeared from nowhere 3 months ago. Nobody asked where it came from, or who approved adding it to the curriculum, or why their kids were learning something that couldn't be used anywhere outside these specific classrooms. The administration answered every practical concern with detailed explanations while completely avoiding the fundamental weirdness of the entire situation. Wednesday in class, I finished my worksheet early and glanced at the sample assessment questions the teacher had posted on the board for next week's test. Every question was a controlled response prompt with limited vocabulary options, like fill in the blank or choose the correct grammatical structure from 3 possibilities. The test wasn't measuring whether we could actually communicate ideas or understand cultural context the way normal language exams did. It was just checking if we could produce specific predetermined responses using exact grammatical structures we'd been drilled on. There were no open-ended questions, no writing prompts asking us to express original thoughts, no listening comprehension that required interpreting meaning from context, just pattern recognition and memorized responses, like we were being trained to operate within a very narrow set of linguistic rules rather than learning an actual living language. Thursday after class, I stayed behind during the teacher's office hours, waiting until the other students left before approaching her desk. I asked directly why she kept telling me to stop resisting instead of addressing my questions about where this language came from and what we were really learning it for. She looked tired and stressed, rubbing her temples like she had a headache, and she said I needed to focus on fluency because my grades were suffering. She warned me that I was spending all my energy fighting the program instead of just learning the material, and at this rate, I was going to fail the class, even though I clearly had the ability to succeed if I would just stop making everything so difficult. I asked again about the origins, and she cut me off, saying she couldn't discuss those details, and I needed to trust that the administration knew what they were doing. Her hands shook slightly as she gathered papers from her desk, and she wouldn't make eye contact, and I realized she was as trapped in this situation as I was, following orders she didn't fully understand or agree with. That weekend, I forced myself to do the Chapelish drills from the workbook, spending 2 hours on Saturday afternoon working through vocabulary exercises and grammar patterns. I needed to pass this class even if I didn't understand what it was really for, and the drills were supposed to help with fluency. About an hour in, something weird happened where the grammar suddenly clicked in a way that felt completely wrong. It was like my brain just accepted these patterns without questioning them anymore, the symbols and structures making sense in a way that felt too easy and too fast. I could form sentences without thinking about the rules, the language flowing naturally, even though I'd been struggling with it for weeks. The ease of it scared me more than the difficulty ever did, because it felt like something was rewiring how my brain processed information, making me think in ways that weren't natural, but felt effortless once they took hold. I stopped the drills and sat there staring at the workbook, trying to figure out what had just happened inside my head. Sunday evening, I listened back to the recordings I'd made of myself doing those drills, analyzing the teaching methods, and trying to understand what made Chapelish stick in my brain so differently than Spanish or French. The approach followed clear behaviorist patterns, all repetition and response with no cultural context or real-world communication practice. We weren't learning about people who spoke this language or the places where it developed or the history that shaped its evolution. We were just being conditioned to produce specific responses to specific prompts, training neural pathways through constant repetition, like teaching a dog to respond to commands. The method felt more like programming than education, building automatic responses rather than actual understanding. Every drill reinforced the same limited structures, never expanding into genuine communication or creative expression, just the same patterns over and over until they became automatic. Monday morning before school, I spent an hour digging through district policy documents on the school website, searching for anything related to the Chapelish program. I found detailed procedures for every other curriculum change from the past 5 years, all requiring parental notification and consent forms and board approval with public comment periods. But there was nothing about Chapelish, no record of the standard protocols being followed, no consent forms sent home for parents to review and sign. Every other pilot program had opt-out procedures clearly listed, but Chapalish had appeared without any of those safeguards. The absence was obvious once I knew what to look for, this gap in the documentation where proper procedures should have been, but weren't, like someone had deliberately bypassed all the normal channels that were supposed to protect students and parents from experimental programs being imposed without permission. That evening, I created an anonymous account and posted in a local parent Facebook group describing concerns about a mandatory language program that had appeared without proper consent or transparency. I kept the details vague, not naming Chapalish specifically, but asking if other parents had noticed similar issues with new programs being implemented without notification or opt-out options. I wanted to gauge whether anyone else found this situation alarming, or if I was the only one who thought schools shouldn't be able to make kids participate in experimental programs without explicit permission. Within an hour, I had 3 comments, all from parents saying they trusted the school administration to make good decisions and that kids these days were too protected and needed to learn to adapt to new challenges. Nobody seemed concerned about the consent issue at all. By Wednesday, I was completely iced out of study groups, the isolation hitting me during lunch when I walked past a table where my friends were working together on homework. They saw me coming and got quiet, then went back to their conversation in a mix of English and Chapalish that I couldn't fully follow anymore. Nobody invited me to sit down or asked if I wanted to join their afternoon study session. Later, I overheard 2 girls from my history class talking about how I was making things harder for everyone by refusing to just go with the program, and one of them said I was being dramatic and difficult for no reason. Friends who used to text me daily had stopped reaching out, and the group chat I'd been part of since freshman year had gone silent whenever I posted anything. The message was clear that my questions and resistance were seen as disruptive and unhelpful, and people would rather exclude me completely than deal with my continued refusal to just accept what was happening. Thursday afternoon during class, I flipped to the back of my advanced Chapalish textbook looking for the publication information, and I noticed a small vendor logo I'd never seen before, printed on the inside back cover. I wrote down the company name and spent that evening searching for connections between this vendor, our school district, and the 17 other schools teaching Chapalish. The company specialized in educational assessment technology and had contracts with several testing organizations, and their website mentioned partnerships with private foundations focused on standardized evaluation methods. I started sketching out a corporate trail, looking for financial connections and shared board members and any pattern that might explain why these specific schools were selected for this coordinated rollout. The vendor had received a large grant from a foundation right before our school year started, and that same foundation had connections to educational research programs studying language acquisition and cognitive assessment methods. That evening, I pulled up Reddit and searched through my saved posts until I found usernames from 3 students who'd commented in that deleted thread before it disappeared. I sent each of them a direct message asking if their advanced Chapalish textbooks had the same vendor logo on the back and whether their schools got any special funding right before the program started. 2 responded within an hour, both confirming their books had identical logos and that their districts received grants from something called an Educational Innovation Foundation just weeks before Chapalish launched. The 3rd student never replied, but the pattern was clear enough that 17 schools didn't just randomly decide to teach the same made-up language on the same Monday morning. Friday morning, I showed up at the guidance office before first period and asked to talk with Gregory Madden about my grades and stress levels. He waved me into his office and listened while I explained how my GPA was dropping because I couldn't focus in Chapalish class and how all my friends had stopped including me in study groups. He nodded and made sympathetic sounds, but then leaned forward and told me I needed to stop fighting battles I couldn't win and focus on my actual schoolwork instead of playing detective. He said the program was approved by people with way more information than I had access to, and that I was creating my own problems by refusing to just go along with something that was clearly helping other students succeed. The meeting ended with him suggesting I use my energy on homework instead of activism, and reminding me that colleges wouldn't care about my concerns if my transcript showed failing grades. I walked out feeling worse than when I went in, because even the counselor whose job was supposed to be helping students was telling me to shut up and accept what was happening. That evening, my mom found me in my room staring at my laptop screen full of notes and research, and she sat down on my bed with this careful expression. She said she'd been thinking about everything I told her, and while she understood why I was upset, I needed to work through proper channels instead of just complaining online and getting myself isolated at the school. She suggested we write a formal letter to the school board with specific questions about the program's approval process and funding sources, something professional that adults would actually take seriously instead of dismissing as teenage drama. She offered to help me draft it over the weekend, so it focused on real policy questions instead of just saying the whole thing felt wrong. We spent Saturday afternoon at the kitchen table working on the letter together, my mom helping me organize my scattered concerns into clear paragraphs that asked about parental consent procedures and transparency requirements, and whether the board even knew about the foundation funding. Sunday morning, I posted in that parent Facebook group again, with a more measured tone, asking if anyone else wanted more information about the pilot program. And this time I got a response from someone named Camilla Zimmerman, who said she was a reporter covering local education issues. She sent me a private message saying my concerns sounded worth looking into, and asked if I'd be willing to talk on the phone about what I'd observed. And she mentioned she could walk me through how Freedom of Information Act requests actually worked if I wanted to request official documents from the district. Monday afternoon, I called Camilla from my room with my door closed, and we talked for almost an hour about everything I'd documented over the past months. She asked detailed questions about the timeline and the vendor information and the other schools, taking notes the whole time and occasionally saying things like, "That's interesting," or "That doesn't sound right." Then she explained how FOIA requests let citizens ask government agencies for records and documents, and she helped me figure out exactly what questions to ask the school district and state education department. She walked me through the specific wording I needed to use to request approval records, funding source documents, and any contracts with private companies, and she explained what kinds of responses I should expect and what it meant if they redacted information or claimed certain things were confidential. Tuesday morning before school, I filled out the FOIA request forms online, typing in the exact language Camilla had helped me craft about Chapalish program approval processes and funding agreements and vendor contracts. I hit submit on both the district request and the state education department request, then sat back feeling this weird mix of official and powerless because now I had to wait 30 days for them to respond. Camilla texted me that afternoon saying good job on filing the requests and reminding me that transparency takes time and patience, that this was how the system worked, even when it felt slow and frustrating. The waiting felt impossible when I wanted answers immediately, but at least I was doing something concrete instead of just asking questions nobody would answer. 2 weeks crawled by with me checking my email obsessively, until finally a message appeared from the district's records department with a PDF attachment. I opened it and found 20 pages of documents, but most of them were covered in thick black redaction bars that blocked out whole paragraphs and sections. What I could read mentioned a private foundation providing grant funding and multiple references to non-disclosure agreements that restricted what information could be shared publicly. The response included a cover letter explaining that certain details were protected by contractual obligations and couldn't be released under FOIA exemptions, which just made me more suspicious about what they were hiding. I forwarded everything to Camilla within minutes, with a message saying this raises way more questions than it answers. She called me that evening, and we went through the documents together line by line, with her explaining the legal language and helping me understand what the unredacted portions actually meant. She'd already started researching the foundation name that appeared in a few places and discovered it specialized in educational technology and standardized testing, not language instruction or cultural programs. Their website materials described something called controlled lexicon assessment, which sounded nothing like learning a real language for communication. Camilla found research papers the foundation had published about creating bias-free testing environments by using completely neutral vocabulary that eliminated cultural advantages, and suddenly, the whole Chapalish program started making sense in a completely different way than I'd been thinking about it. I sat at my desk that night reading through the foundation's materials, and the pieces clicked together in my head. This wasn't about teaching us a language that existed in some other country or preparing us for global communication. The program was creating a standardized testing tool that worked by forcing everyone to think within the same tight grammatical rules and limited vocabulary, so nobody had cultural or linguistic advantages over anyone else. Listen to 90 seconds and rate me 5 stars on Spotify. Doing a giveaway for people who did this and show proof on my Instagram. There will be 4 winners, and you get to choose between a Spotify or Amazon gift card. The clarity everyone kept talking about wasn't some magical property of Chapalish, but just the cognitive ease of working inside a system with no room for interpretation or creative expression. Students weren't becoming fluent in communication. They were being trained to produce specific predetermined responses using exact structures that could be easily measured and compared across different schools and populations. I started rewriting my concerns in a new document, shifting away from arguing that Chapalish was fake toward asking questions about consent and transparency, and whether schools could turn students into research subjects without telling them. The issue wasn't whether controlled lexicon testing had educational value, it was whether districts could implement experimental programs funded by private foundations without informing parents or giving families the option to opt out. It was whether students should be test subjects for corporate research about language acquisition and cognitive assessment without anyone explicitly agreeing to participate in a study. The program might work exactly as designed, but that didn't make it okay to roll it out in 17 schools without proper consent procedures or honest communication about what was really being tested and measured and who was collecting the data and why. Wednesday afternoon, I pulled up the district website and found the school board member contact information listed in a public directory. Eli Reardon's email address was right there, along with his photo and a short bio about serving on the board for 6 years. I opened a new message and started typing, keeping my tone respectful and curious rather than angry or accusatory. I explained I was a student in the Chapelish program and had obtained FOIA documents showing private foundation funding, NDAS, restricting transparency, and no parental consent procedures for what appeared to be educational research. I attached the relevant documents and asked if he was aware of these elements when the board approved the program. I read through the email 3 times before hitting send, making sure every sentence focused on specific procedural questions rather than attacking anyone personally. The message went through and I closed my laptop, not expecting to hear back for weeks, if at all, since board members probably got hundreds of emails from concerned parents and students. Thursday morning, I woke up to a response from Eli that completely surprised me. He said he'd like to meet briefly to discuss my questions and suggested my mother attend as well since these concerns involved district policy. He admitted he wasn't aware of NDAS or private foundation involvement when the board reviewed the program, and he sounded genuinely interested in understanding what I'd discovered rather than dismissive like the principal had been. I showed the email to my mom before school, and she immediately agreed to meet with him, saying she wanted to hear directly from a board member about how this program got approved without proper transparency. We scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday at a coffee shop near the school, which felt surreal because I'd never imagined a school board member would actually take my concerns seriously enough to meet in person. Tuesday afternoon, my mother and I walked into the coffee shop and found Eli already sitting at a corner table with a notepad in front of him. He stood up to shake our hands and thanked us for taking the time to meet, then asked me to walk him through what I'd discovered. I pulled out the printed FOIA documents and spread them across the table, pointing out the references to private foundation funding, the contractual restrictions on information sharing, and the data collection protocols that were never mentioned to parents. Eli read through each page carefully, and his expression shifted from polite interest to visible discomfort as he absorbed the details about NDAS and research purposes. He explained the board's approval process had focused entirely on the educational benefits of adding a language option, with the principal presenting Chapelish as an innovative pilot program that would give students competitive advantages. Nobody mentioned private foundation involvement or research protocols or contractual restrictions on transparency, and Eli said if he'd known about those elements, he would have asked very different questions during the approval meeting. Eli closed the folder and said he was going to request that Chapelish be added as an agenda item for the next board meeting, so these questions could be addressed publicly. He explained the board approved the program based on limited information, and if there were transparency issues or consent gaps, those needed to be corrected regardless of how well the program worked educationally. My mother asked what the timeline looked like, and Eli said the next meeting was in 3 weeks, which meant we had time to gather any additional documentation or parent concerns that should be part of the public discussion. He thanked me again for bringing this to his attention and said it took courage to question something everyone else seemed to accept without problem. Walking back to the car, my mother squeezed my shoulder and said she was proud of how I'd handled the meeting, staying focused on facts and procedures rather than getting emotional or defensive. Thursday after school, the Chapelish teacher caught me in the hallway and asked quietly if we could talk for a minute. We stepped into an empty classroom and she closed the door, then asked why I was trying to undermine the program when it was helping so many students learn faster and think more clearly. I explained I wasn't against students learning Chapelish, but against the lack of informed consent and transparency, and I said parents deserved to know about the research component and foundation funding before their kids were enrolled in what was presented as just a language class. She looked tired and stressed, admitting she was under enormous pressure from the administration to maintain enrollment numbers and show positive outcomes because the grant funding depended on participation rates. She said she'd wanted to be more transparent from the beginning, but the NDAs she signed restricted what she could discuss about the program's origins and purposes, and she felt trapped between doing her job and being honest with students and parents about what was really happening. The following Monday, the principal called me to his office during lunch, and I knew before I even sat down that this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. He started by saying he'd heard I was spreading misinformation that could damage the school's reputation and put important educational opportunities at risk. I tried to explain about the FOIA documents and the meeting with Eli, but he cut me off, saying my activism was creating unnecessary controversy and making other students uncomfortable when they just wanted to focus on learning. He never addressed any of my specific questions about NDAS or consent procedures, instead focusing on how my behavior was disruptive and how I needed to think about the bigger picture of what was best for the school community. I left his office feeling angry and frustrated because he'd completely ignored the substance of my concerns and tried to frame everything as me being difficult rather than the administration failing to follow proper procedures. That evening, Alex texted me a long message saying he didn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of this when colleges were already starting to recognize Chapelish proficiency on applications. He said our friendship had been strained for weeks, and he was tired of feeling like he had to choose between supporting me and participating in something that was actually helping his future. The message felt like a breaking point, where he was choosing the practical benefits of going along with the program over supporting my right to question it. I read the text 3 times and didn't respond because I didn't know what to say that wouldn't make things worse between us. Camilla called me Wednesday evening with news that changed everything about how I understood the principal's role in this program. She'd been digging through public records and foundation materials and discovered the principal sat on an advisory panel for the same foundation funding the Chapelish pilot program. This was a significant conflict of interest that was never disclosed to the board or parents, and it explained why he'd been so defensive about transparency questions. Camilla asked if I was comfortable with her including this information in a story she was planning to publish before the board meeting. And I said yes, because parents deserved to know about the financial connections that might be influencing how the program was presented and defended. My mother called the school Thursday morning and requested a formal meeting with the principal to discuss transparency and parental notification procedures. She brought printed copies of the FOIA documents showing the NDAS and foundation involvement, laying them out on his desk and asking direct questions about why parents weren't informed about the research component. The principal became defensive, insisting the program was properly approved and parents had been notified through regular school communications about new course offerings. My mother pointed out there was a difference between announcing a new language class and disclosing that students would be research subjects in a private foundation study, and she said the lack of opt-out procedures was particularly concerning. The principal agreed to provide more information to parents, but framed it as clarification rather than admission of any procedural failures, and my mother left the meeting feeling like he was more worried about protecting the school's reputation than addressing legitimate consent issues. 3 days before the scheduled board meeting, the district sent out a memo to all families with students enrolled in Chapelish. The memo reframed the program as an optional enrichment opportunity pending comprehensive review, which was the first time anyone had suggested it might not be mandatory. The language was carefully worded to sound like this was always the plan, describing the program as a pilot initiative that families could choose to continue or discontinue based on their individual preferences. My mother read the memo twice and said the sudden shift suggested the administration was worried about public scrutiny at the upcoming board meeting. I saved a copy of the memo because it contradicted everything we'd been told for months about Chapelish being a required part of the curriculum, and the timing made it obvious this was a response to the questions Eli and other board members were starting to ask about consent procedures and transparency. The social split happened fast. Within days of the memo going out, you could see clear lines forming in the hallways between kids who thought I was making a big deal out of nothing and kids who started questioning whether this whole thing was actually okay. People stopped sitting together at lunch based on which side they were on, and group chats divided into pro-Chapelish channels and questioning channels. I never wanted to be the face of anything, but suddenly everyone knew I was the one who filed the FOIA requests and talked to the reporter and got my mom involved. Conversations would stop when I walked past groups in the hallway, and I could feel people watching me, judging whether I was brave or just causing problems for no reason. Some kids started calling me paranoid in their social media posts without using my name, but everyone knew who they meant. The worst part was seeing friends I'd known since middle school choosing sides, deciding whether my questions mattered more than the benefits they were getting from being fluent in Chapelish. I spent Tuesday night thinking about what to do next, and I realized attacking the program itself wasn't going to work because too many people liked it and were doing well in it. But consent and transparency were different. Those were principles that should matter to everyone, regardless of how they felt about Chapalish. I started drafting a petition Wednesday morning before school, keeping the language focused and specific. The petition didn't say Chapalish was bad or demand it be shut down. It asked for 3 things: complete information about funding sources and research purposes, voluntary participation with no academic penalties for opting out, and proper consent procedures going forward for any similar programs. I printed 20 copies in the library and started approaching people I thought might sign. The first few conversations were awkward because I had to explain I wasn't trying to end the program, just make it optional and transparent. Some people refused immediately, saying they didn't want drama or didn't see the point, but others read the petition carefully and said the consent stuff made sense even if they planned to keep taking Chapalish. By Thursday, I had 15 signatures, and by Friday, I had 30. Over the next week, I kept collecting signatures during lunch, before school, and between classes. I approached kids I barely knew, explaining the petition in the same careful way each time. Some signed because they agreed with my concerns about the NDAS and foundation involvement. Others signed because they believed in procedural fairness, even though they loved Chapalish and thought I was overreacting. A few teachers signed too, quietly, when I caught them alone in their classrooms. They didn't want to be public about it, but they agreed students and parents deserved complete information before being enrolled in experimental programs. The petition grew to 50 signatures, then 70, then 90. I kept a spreadsheet tracking who signed and when, documenting everything like I'd been doing since this whole thing started. By the end of the week, I had 112 signatures, which felt significant, even though it was only a fraction of the students enrolled in Chapalish. Nobody yelled at me or tried to stop me from collecting signatures, which surprised me. The whole thing happened quietly, with people reading the petition and making their own choices. Monday morning, the administration sent out a new memo to all students. It didn't mention my petition by name, but the timing and content made it obvious what they were responding to. The memo reminded everyone that district policy prohibited certain types of organizing during school hours that could disrupt the learning environment. It said students who wanted to advocate for policy changes should work through proper channels like student government or parent committees. The memo warned that continued disruptions could result in disciplinary action, though it didn't specify what that meant. The message was clear: stop collecting signatures or face consequences. The hallways felt tense after that memo went out. People who had been considering signing my petition backed off, afraid of getting in trouble. Kids who had already signed started asking if they could remove their names, worried about what might happen. I told them the petition was voluntary and they could withdraw if they wanted, but I wasn't stopping. The administration's warning actually convinced me this mattered more than I'd realized, because if they weren't worried, they wouldn't be trying to shut it down. Tuesday afternoon, Gregory Madden called me down to his office during study hall. He had my file open on his desk and a concerned expression that looked practiced. He said he'd noticed my grades dropping over the past month, and my stress levels seemed really high based on reports from teachers. He suggested I might benefit from talking to someone about anxiety, maybe getting an evaluation to see if medication could help me manage these feelings. I sat there looking at him, understanding exactly what was happening. This wasn't about helping me. This was about reframing my activism as a mental health problem, making it seem like my concerns came from anxiety rather than legitimate questions about consent and transparency. I told him my stress was a normal response to watching an experimental program get rolled out without proper oversight. I said I wasn't interested in medication because my anxiety wasn't a chemical imbalance that needed treatment. It was a reasonable reaction to an unreasonable situation. He pushed back gently, saying sometimes we don't recognize when our reactions are disproportionate to the actual situation. I thanked him for his concern and left his office, adding this conversation to my documentation because it felt like another attempt to silence questions by suggesting the questioner was unstable. Wednesday evening, my mother showed me a post in the parent Facebook group that had gone up that afternoon. It was from Alex's family, a long defense of the Chapalish program, praising its innovative approach and the opportunities it was creating for students. The post talked about how their son had thrived in the program, how his cognitive abilities had improved, and how grateful they were for the school's forward-thinking leadership. Then it shifted to criticizing resistance to the program, suggesting it came from people who didn't understand modern education or were resistant to change. The post never mentioned me by name, but the comments section filled up with pointed remarks about students who create drama instead of focusing on learning, parents who question everything instead of trusting educators, and people who try to ruin good programs because of their own insecurity. I read through the comments feeling more alone than I had since this whole thing started. These were parents I'd known my whole life, people who used to drive me and Alex to soccer practice and host birthday parties. Now they were calling me dramatic and difficult without using my name. My mother put her hand on my shoulder and said not to read the comments, but I couldn't stop. I needed to see how bad it had gotten, how completely I'd been isolated by asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Thursday afternoon, Camilla called me with an update. She said her investigation was ready to publish, and she'd scheduled it to go live 3 days before the board meeting. But she needed an on-the-record parent source to make the story credible, someone willing to be quoted by name about the consent concerns and lack of transparency. I told her I'd ask my mother. That evening I explained what Camilla needed, and my mother sat quietly thinking about it for a long time. She understood being quoted by name would make our family visible in this controversy, that people would know exactly who was raising these questions. But she said transparency was important enough to take that risk, and if she was asking the school to be transparent, then she needed to be transparent too. She called Camilla back and agreed to be the parent source, answering questions about when she first learned about the foundation funding, how the consent procedures failed, and why she believed the district needed stronger oversight of experimental programs. Friday afternoon, the school board posted the agenda for their next meeting on the district website. I checked it obsessively, refreshing the page until the PDF finally loaded. There it was, listed under New Business, Chapelish Program Review, and Community Input. The listing said the item would be addressed in open session, which meant community members could attend and speak during public comment. Seeing it there in official board meeting language made everything feel suddenly real. My months of documentation and questions were finally being taken seriously enough to warrant discussion at a public meeting. I saved 3 copies of the agenda, 1 digital and 2 printed, adding them to the folder of evidence I'd been building since September. That night I got an email from the Chapelish teacher that surprised me. She said she wanted to apologize for her tone in our previous conversations and for not being more helpful when I asked questions. She explained she'd been following a tight script dictated by her contract and the NDAS she signed when she took this job. She said she wanted to answer my questions from the beginning, but was legally restricted from discussing the Foundation's research goals or the data being collected on student language acquisition patterns. The email felt like a confession, an admission that my instincts had been right all along. She was just a teacher trying to keep her job, caught between contractual obligations and students who deserved honest answers. I stayed up late Sunday night preparing what I'd say at the board meeting. My mother helped me organize everything into a clear timeline. When Chapelish started, when I discovered the other schools, when I filed the FOIA requests, when I learned about the NDAS and foundation funding. We arranged the documents in order, highlighting the key points about consent procedures and transparency failures. I practiced presenting the evidence calmly, keeping my voice steady and factual. My mother reminded me to focus on procedural questions rather than attacking individuals, to frame everything around the principle that students and parents deserve informed consent before participating in experimental programs. I rehearsed my 3-minute statement over and over, timing myself, cutting unnecessary words, making sure every sentence counted. The petition signatures were organized in a binder, the FOIA responses were tabbed with sticky notes, and the timeline was printed on a single page that board members could follow easily. Everything was ready. Tomorrow night, I'd walk into that board meeting and present months of documentation to people who actually had the power to require transparency and proper consent procedures. I felt scared and determined at the same time, knowing this was the moment everything had been building toward since that first Monday when Chapelish appeared out of nowhere. The board meeting room was already filling up when my mother and I walked through the doors at 6:30. Parents were claiming seats in the rows of folding chairs, while students clustered near the back wall and teachers sat together on the left side near the windows. I spotted the local news camera setting up in the rear corner, with a guy adjusting the tripod and checking angles while his partner tested the lighting. Camilla was sitting in the press section off to the side, her laptop open and her phone recording audio as she typed notes about who was arriving and where people were positioning themselves. The 5 board members were arranging papers at the long table in front, while the district attorney sat at the end reviewing documents. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat as I walked to the sign-up sheet for public comment and wrote my name in the 3rd slot. My hands were shaking enough that my signature looked messy and uneven. My mother squeezed my shoulder, and we found seats in the 4th row where I could see everything but wasn't right in front. More people kept arriving until the room was completely packed with standing room only along the walls. I recognized kids from my Chapelish class, parents from the PTA meetings, and teachers who had been using Chapelish phrases in their regular classes. The principal was talking quietly with the superintendent near the front table, both of them looking serious and occasionally glancing toward the crowd. At 7 o'clock exactly, the board president called the meeting to order and went through the standard procedural stuff about approving minutes and reviewing the agenda. My leg was bouncing up and down without me meaning to do it, and I had to force myself to sit still and focus on breathing normally. The first two people who signed up for public comment spoke about budget concerns and athletic program funding, taking their full 3 minutes to present spreadsheets and talk about resource allocation. Then my name was called and I stood up, my folder of documents clutched against my chest, and walked to the microphone stand in front of the board table. I opened the folder and pulled out my timeline sheet, setting it where the board members could see it. Then I started talking in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt. I explained how Chapalish appeared at our school on a Monday morning with no prior announcement or parental notification, how I discovered through online research that 16 other schools started teaching the identical language on the same day, and how my attempts to find information about its origin led nowhere until I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the district. I held up the FOIA responses, showing the redacted references to private foundation funding and the multiple mentions of non-disclosure agreements that prevented school officials from discussing the program's research purposes. I explained that students were learning this language with unusual speed and reporting cognitive changes, that the program expanded from a single class to signage throughout the building, and that participation became effectively mandatory, with no opt-out procedures or parental consent forms. I presented the petition with over 100 signatures from students and parents asking for transparency about funding sources, data collection protocols, and the research purposes behind the program. My 3 minutes were almost up, so I finished by asking the board to require full disclosure of the foundation partnership and make participation voluntary with proper informed consent procedures. I could see several board members leaning forward and taking notes, while others were looking at their phones with concerned expressions. When I returned to my seat, my mother grabbed my hand and held it tight. The board president asked if staff wanted to respond to my testimony, but the principal said he would prefer to wait until all public comment was finished. While the next person was walking to the microphone, I saw board members passing phones to each other and pointing at screens, their faces getting more serious as they read something. Camilla was typing rapidly on her laptop, and I realized her story must have just gone live on the education news site. The headline was probably showing up on board members' phones right now, with all the documented evidence about undisclosed conflicts of interest and missing consent procedures. Eli leaned over to read the article on another board member's phone, and his expression shifted from curious to genuinely concerned as he scrolled through the documented procedural failures. The next two speakers defended the Chapalish program, talking about how their kids were excelling in the class and showing improved cognitive abilities, but then a mother stood up and said she was angry that nobody told her the program involved research or data collection on her child. Another parent asked why there were no consent forms or opt-out options when every other pilot program in the district required parental permission and notification. A father said he felt blindsided learning from a news article that his son was essentially a research subject in a study funded by a private foundation with connections to the school administration. The testimony made it clear this wasn't just me being difficult or creating drama, but a real community concern about transparency and parental rights in educational decisions. More parents spoke, some supporting the program's benefits, but several expressing frustration about the lack of information and the mandatory nature of participation. After nearly 40 minutes of public comment, the board president closed that section and asked the principal to present the administration's perspective. The principal stood at the microphone and delivered talking points about innovative pilot programs and the importance of future-ready skills, but Eli interrupted him to ask a direct question about the non-disclosure agreements. The principal looked uncomfortable and said he was bound by contractual obligations, which made Eli turn to the district's legal counsel and ask whether the board's original approval was based on complete information about the foundation partnership and data collection protocols. The attorney shifted in his seat and admitted that the full scope of the research component and the NDA requirements were not included in the initial presentation to the board back in August. The presentation had focused primarily on curriculum benefits and student outcomes without explaining the private funding source or the restrictions on discussing program purposes. Eli asked why the board wasn't informed about these elements, and the attorney said the administration believed they had discretion to negotiate partnerships without board approval as long as they stayed within approved budget allocations. Another board member asked about the conflict of interest, since the principal sits on an advisory panel for the foundation funding the program, and the attorney acknowledged that connection should have been disclosed before the board voted on approval. The room got very quiet as board members processed this information and looked at each other with expressions that suggested they were realizing they had approved something without understanding what they were actually approving. The board president asked the principal directly whether students and parents were informed about the research purposes and data collection, and the principal said the program was presented as an educational opportunity with the understanding that assessment data would be collected like any other class. Eli pointed out that's not the same as informed consent for participation in a research study funded by a private foundation, and several parents in the audience nodded in agreement. The discussion continued for another hour, with board members asking detailed questions about the foundation's research goals, the data being collected, and why standard consent procedures weren't followed. The principal finally proposed a temporary pause on the mandatory requirement while a review committee examines the program's implementation, consent procedures, and data protocols. He framed this as a proactive step to address community concerns and ensure the program meets district standards for transparency and parental notification. Everyone in the room knew this was a response to the public pressure and media coverage rather than voluntary transparency, but at least it was movement in the right direction. The board president asked for a motion to convert the pilot program from mandatory to opt-in status, pending the review committee's recommendations. Eli made the motion, and another board member seconded it immediately. The discussion before the vote focused on whether current students should be automatically enrolled or whether everyone should need new consent forms. The board decided that students currently enrolled could continue if they chose, but new enrollment would require explicit parental consent forms that fully explain the foundation partnership, research purposes, and data collection protocols. When the vote was called, all 5 board members raised their hands in favor, and the motion passed unanimously. I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me, mixed with exhaustion that made my whole body feel heavy and tired. My mother hugged me right there in our seats and whispered that she was proud of how I handled the pressure and stayed focused on principles rather than attacking people personally. We stayed for the rest of the meeting, even though the other agenda items were boring budget stuff, and then we walked out to the parking lot where Camilla was waiting to ask how I felt about the outcome. I told her it wasn't a complete victory, but it represented real progress toward transparency and consent, and she said, sometimes that's how change happens, through small steps, rather than dramatic transformations. The next morning at the school felt different somehow, like the tension that had been building for months was finally releasing. Kids were talking about the board meeting in hallways, and several people told me they signed the petition because they agreed consent mattered, even if they liked the program. Between second and third period, the chapelish teacher found me at my locker and thanked me quietly for raising these issues. She said she felt relieved that the NDA pressure was lifting and she could finally be honest with students about the program's research purposes. She admitted the secrecy made her uncomfortable from the beginning, but she needed the job and felt trapped between contractual obligations and her professional ethics about transparency with students. I told her I understood she was in a difficult position and I wasn't trying to make her life harder, just trying to get answers about what was happening to us. She said she appreciated that and asked if I would be willing to continue in the class now that it was voluntary. And I said I needed to think about it because I still had questions about the cognitive effects and whether the benefits were worth the risks. That afternoon, while I was walking home, my phone buzzed with a text from Alex. The message said he didn't fully understand the consent issues until he heard the board meeting discussion and listened to other parents talk about transparency and parental rights. He didn't apologize for choosing the program over our friendship or for the months of tension between us, but he admitted I was right to ask questions, even when it was uncomfortable and unpopular. He suggested maybe we could talk sometime without all the pressure and arguments that had been defining our interactions since September. I texted back saying I would like that, and maybe we could get coffee this weekend and just talk about normal stuff, without chapelish being the main topic. He sent back a thumbs up, and I felt this small spark of hope that our friendship might survive this whole mess, even if it looked different from before. 3 days later, I got an email from the district asking if I would join a review committee to help redesign the chapelish program as a voluntary elective. The committee would include 2 other students, 3 parents, 2 teachers, and Eli as the board representative, and our job was to make sure the new version had real consent procedures and clear information about what students were signing up for. I showed the email to my mother, and she said this was exactly the kind of outcome we hoped for when we started asking questions, that the district was actually listening and trying to fix the problems instead of just defending what they did wrong. The first meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday after school in the district office conference room. My mother spent that weekend organizing her own project, reaching out to other parents who attended the board meeting and suggesting they form an oversight group focused on transparency. She sent emails to about 20 families, and 15 parents showed up for the first meeting at our house on Sunday afternoon. They sat around our living room drinking coffee and talking about how to prevent similar situations from happening with other programs. And by the end of the meeting, they had created a checklist of questions to ask whenever the district announced partnerships with private companies or foundations. The checklist covered things like what data gets collected, who owns it, how long it's stored, whether parents can opt out, and what happens to students who don't participate. My mother printed copies and said she would share it with the PTA and post it in the parent Facebook groups, so other families could use it for future pilot programs. Meanwhile, Camilla was working on her follow-up story about how our district's response might become a model for other schools dealing with similar education technology partnerships. She interviewed education policy experts who said the community's focus on consent and transparency was exactly what needed to happen more often, and she talked to administrators from 2 other districts who were watching our situation to see how it played out. The story published on Thursday and got shared widely on social media, with comments from parents in other states saying they wished their schools would be this responsive when concerns got raised. Camilla told me the attention was opening doors for her professionally, that state education publications were reaching out, asking if she could cover similar stories for them, and she seemed excited about the possibility of expanding her reporting beyond just local school board meetings. The school schedule changed the following Monday, with Chapalish moving from mandatory second period to an optional elective offered during 4 different periods throughout the day. Students who wanted to continue got information packets explaining the controlled lexicon research, the data collection protocols, and exactly what the private foundation was studying about language acquisition patterns. The packets included consent forms that had to be signed by both students and parents, and there was clear language saying you could drop the class at any time without it affecting your grades in other subjects. About 40% of the previously enrolled students chose to continue once they understood what the program actually was, while the rest dropped it now that the social pressure was gone. I saw kids in the hallway talking about their decisions without the weird tension that used to surround anything related to Chapalish, like it was just a normal choice about electives instead of some kind of loyalty test. The first review committee meeting happened on Tuesday, and I walked into the conference room feeling nervous about whether adults would actually listen to student perspectives or just pretend to care. But Eli started the meeting by saying the whole point was to make sure future programs included real student input from the beginning, and he asked us to share what information we wished we had received before Chapalish started. I talked about wanting to know the research purposes up front, and the other 2 students mentioned wanting clear opt-out procedures and understanding what data was collected. The 3 parents on the committee added concerns about notification timelines and the right to review materials before their kids got enrolled. We spent 2 hours drafting consent form language and communication protocols that would apply to all future pilot programs, and the teachers helped us understand what was realistic to implement while the board member took notes on everything we suggested. The whole process felt meaningful and collaborative instead of adults just telling us what they already decided. My friendship with Alex started slowly getting better as the divisions around Chapalish faded and people stopped treating it like you had to pick a side. We started eating lunch together again on Thursday, just the 2 of us at first without the whole group, and we talked about normal stuff like video games and weekend plans instead of constantly arguing about the program. Our relationship wasn't exactly the same as before because we both knew we could disagree about important things, but we were learning how to stay friends even when we saw situations differently. He admitted he felt relieved that the pressure was gone and he could just take the class because he found the linguistics interesting rather than because everyone expected him to. The Chapalish teacher completely changed how she ran the class once the NDA restrictions were lifted and the program became voluntary. She started each session by explaining the controlled lexicon research and how it fit into broader studies of language acquisition and cognitive processing. Students who stayed enrolled seemed to appreciate understanding the purpose behind what they were learning, and the classroom atmosphere became more collaborative with the teacher answering questions honestly instead of deflecting everything. She showed us research papers about how simplified grammar structures affect learning speed and asked us to think critically about what the studies revealed and what they missed. 3 months after the board meeting, the district formally adopted new policies requiring parental consent and transparent disclosure for all partnerships with private foundations or vendors that involved student data collection. The policies included mandatory 30-day review periods before programs could start clear opt-out procedures that didn't penalize students academically, and quarterly reports to the board about ongoing research programs. The superintendent presented the new policies at a public meeting and credited community input for shaping a framework that protected student privacy while still allowing innovative educational programs. My mother attended that meeting and came home saying she felt proud of what we accomplished together, that we proved regular people could push for accountability and actually get systemic changes instead of just complaining. I sleep better now knowing I asked the right questions, even when it was socially hard and emotionally draining. My relationship with my mother got stronger because we worked together on something that mattered to both of us, and I learned she would support me even when my concerns made things complicated. My boundaries with friends are clearer because I know I can disagree with people without losing them completely, and I understand that speaking up for transparency isn't about being difficult, but about protecting everyone's right to make informed choices about their education and their data. That's the story for today. I am really thankful you were here because it makes sharing these moments so much more meaningful. I hope it brought you a little bit of peace or hope. Subscribe if you would like to keep spending time together.